Considering I'm as big a fantasy nerd as I am, it probably doesn't come as much of a surprise that I'm also a pretty big fan of most things superhero related. I remember being really into X-Men as a kid. X-Men Legends was one of my absolute favorite titles in my younger days, and when I got a bit older, I remember thoroughly enjoying the Batman Arkham games. What's funny is that I consumed most of my superhero media in my younger days through video games. I'm not particularly a movie buff, so while I certainly don't dislike all the new superhero movies that we've gotten over the past few years, I'd be lying if I tried to claim that I've ridden the wave of new visual media over the last 15 years or so in the same way that many others have. And ironically, the only thing I might dig less than movies are comic books. Now, you've got to understand, it's an incredibly weird spot for me. Beyond the fact that I have people in my immediate personal circle that are not only huge fans of comics, but have succeeded in making comics and comic-based properties significant parts of their professional lives, I truly do enjoy several aspects of comic books. Absent of my own interest in many of the characters that populate popular comics, I love the art styles, whether it be the more traditional American superhero style or the more artistic takes found in many Japanese manga. The way they can seamlessly blend art into the experience is probably better done than any other text medium to date, and the way that they can so seamlessly turn into long runners will always be super impressive to me. And yet, I just don't find them very fun to read. I'll almost always reach for a traditional book when given the choice. That's why I think I've always found Comix Zone to be a really cool little game. Developed and published by Sega as a late-stage title for the Genesis, this beat-em-up lets the player take control of the aptly named protagonist Sketch Turner as they literally traverse the pages of a comic book. This is possible because one night when Sketch is hard at work on the comic in question, hanging out with his pet rat named Roadkill in a New York apartment that he definitely can't afford as a struggling artist, the main villain of his own comic, a sprightly fellow by the name of Mortis, somehow leaps off the page after a lightning strike and chucks Turner into the book, leaving him to fight his way through his own brainchild with the help of one of his characters, Alyssa, in order to escape and stop Mortis from destroying the world. The history of this game is a bit interesting because it's painfully obvious that Sega wanted it to just ooze character, and in fairness, it does, but the way they went about communicating that message is just decidedly odd. Depending on the location, certain versions of the game came with either a physical tie-in comic or a CD loaded with a bunch of rock and metal tracks by bands that were known but not necessarily popular. In retrospect, the latter was described by Hardcore Gaming 101 as the type of, quote, crazy promotional crap that publishers pumped out when trying to drive sales and interest. What's so confusing about these endeavors is that they completely missed the opportunity to just let the game do all the talking instead. All the character that they tried to convey through those promotions is more than present in the literal game itself. That is best seen in the graphical presentation. The way that Comix Zone captures the expressive, vibrant nature of any decent superhero-style comic is stunning. The graphics are so detailed both during gameplay and cutscenes that it's almost difficult to appreciate when you're playing through it. You're better off going back afterwards to truly appreciate what it puts in front of the player. It does its dank sewers just as well as its clifftop peaks with a healthy smattering of color and sincerely outstanding shading work. Might I remind you again that everything you've seen on screen was done on the Genesis? It really is insane, even in hindsight, just how much from a graphical standpoint that developers managed to squeeze out of these 16-bit consoles. This could pass as a modern timepiece, for Christ's sake. It really isn't much of a surprise that the general art direction for Comix Zone is so strong when you learn that they hired a bunch of comic book legends to work on various parts of the game. Tony DeZuniga and Alex Nino, both of whom's name I hope I am pronouncing correctly, did significant work for both Marvel and DC over their careers, and they designed various parts of the visuals in conjunction with the staff at Sega. Shocker, the game with a supergroup of artists working on it looks good. It doesn't just look good either, because while Sega was wasting time making sure Danzig and the boys got some free publicity, the in-game music is basically nothing but banger after banger after banger. Rock riffs galore, it's practically a non-stop onslaught of jams for every cutscene, level, and boss fight. It never lets up, and it's better for it. It captures the fun rock and roll essence of the game to a T. I also love that it just lets you listen to the tracks in the options menu. There isn't much reason for you to, but it's a cool feature nonetheless. nonetheless. What might be most impressive about Comix Zone is how it goes about delivering all of this. Yes, it clearly looks like a comic book, that much is obvious, but more importantly, it feels like one as well. It's lighthearted and quirky, the characters speak through floating text bubbles complete with a lot of humor and censored profanity, Mortis literally draws enemies for you to fight into the panels from the real world, and the story is seriously unserious enough that it keeps you playing. There are plenty of great games that adapt comic properties, but Comix Zone might be the pinnacle of actually adapting the comic book as a medium itself. It's the perfect fix for when you don't feel like reading, which, let's be honest, who reads? It reached the point that it was considered such a direct translation of the physical medium that Sega applied for and was subsequently granted a patent surrounding making a video game product around the idea of a comic book in 1994. I highly doubt they've used that patent since, but it's kinda neat that they actually successfully got it. And it's a good thing that the game has all this personality because the gameplay itself is just fine. Like, it's fun to play, being a mix of side-scroller and fighting game. You patrol through each level however you choose, through branching paths, collecting items, and finding secrets along the way, while your attacks are based around what direction you're inputting, letting you hit enemies high, low, or center. Enemies are fairly smart, being plenty willing to block, meaning you've got to vary your attacks and be prepared for what they might throw at you in retaliation. Mashing buttons is a great way to get yourself killed in short order. You can also use roadkill to distract enemies or reach areas that you can't yourself, helping to solve puzzles along the way. It's a simplistic format, but the variety of enemies and areas keeps it fresh enough for the duration of the game. Which is probably because said game is only half an hour long. Yeah, so Comix Zone relies heavily, and I do mean heavily, on what I'll call difficulty-based length. Without a question, to make up for the fact that the game was so short, likely due to how much time they instead put into developing the appearance and overall vibe, the game is back-breakingly difficult to make sure you have to spend quite a bit of time to get through it. You have extremely limited lives and have to start at the beginning of the 3 multi-level stages when you run out. There is a lot of tight platforming and traps that can destroy your health, if not lead to outright insta-death, and then there's the most unbelievable mechanic of all, which is the fact that hitting anything, usually various objects throughout the level, that isn't an enemy results in you losing health. Using special moves also makes you lose health. With extremely limited healing items to be found in most cases, this is a borderline absurd mechanic. It's made even worse by the fact that while you can utilize items to remove obstacles without losing health, there are going to be opportunities where you basically have no choice. There oftentimes just aren't enough items to be found for every roadblock. The bosses themselves as well are insanely difficult, especially Kung Fung, him and his weird fingernails. I do have a sincere problem with this, don't get me wrong, both pertaining to the length and what I consider to be completely predatory, basically player-hostile difficulty, but I also have to admit that the difficulty isn't as big an issue today because, let's be honest, if you're playing Comix Zone today, that means you have the ability to save state, and the length, while not ideal, is buoyed a bit by just how well crafted everything else is. I think that's why, though I have something of a soft spot for Comix Zone, I don't think it necessarily qualifies as a good game. Like, it looks and sounds fantastic and has phenomenal vibes, but everything else suffered due to the fact that it's painfully obvious that was where most, if not all of the focus for the game actually went to during production. As the player, you're left wanting more. You're going to want more panels and areas to jump through and explore, but you probably aren't going to actually want to play that much longer on account of the fact that you'll be busy pulling your hair out as you trial and error your way through the gameplay, even with save states. I do think you should suffer the gameplay at least once, if you can still get the game that is, because it was delisted from some retailers along with other Sega games back in December, though it does still seem to be up in some places, because the atmosphere really is that good. It's a relic from its day, but it's a good one, and its truly unique conversion of the comic book medium is as impressive as the day is long.